time. Thanks everybody for coming. This is actually a very good crowd for a sort of midsummer master's presentation. I was going to call it a defense, but it's really just sort of it's an informal presentation. My pleasure to introduce Ashtin, who I met, I guess it's a little over 3 years ago now, in my radar class as an undergraduate. So Ashtin is from Milwaukee, became an undergraduate student here in, I guess it must have been 2014 then, or no, 2012.
Yeah.
In 2012. Got her undergraduate degree from our department in 2016, and then approached me about 2 years ago, or 2.5 years ago, to come back and do our master's degree. And so since then, we've been working together on understanding what the sort of information content of hyperspectral infrared observations are for trying to retrieve not just single layer ice clouds, which is something that we know can be done and fairly effectively with these measurements, but also scenes where you may have a single layer ice cloud above some kind of a liquid cloud below. And so she's been doing a lot of sort of detailed theoretical calculations using some ground-based observations as a database and some radiative transfer modeling to try to understand what the capabilities of AIRS specifically is for doing these retrievals in these multi-layer scenarios. Ashton's going to be finishing up her master's here sometime this month. And then after that, I guess she's ready to go out and try to join the workforce here. So she's also right now in that fun process of doing job interviews and other things. So we wish her luck as well here in the next month or so.
Yeah, fun process. But thank you all for coming, and thanks for the intro. The title of my talk today is Using Information Content to Determine the Sensitivity of AIRS Channels to Single and Multi-Layer Ice Clouds in the Midlatitudes. So I've picked this picture as the cover of my slide, cover of my presentation. I took this from my old apartment, and I thought it kind of captures some of the qualitative aspects of what we're talking about today. I mainly took the picture because I thought that cloud looked like a centipede, but it sort of is applicable today. Our talk is focusing on cirrus clouds. So this is an example of a single layer cirrus. These clouds are typically thin, composed of ice, and at high altitudes. I have a good case of multi-layer cirrus clouds here. This is a video from the rooftop. The wind shear really makes the cloud layers obvious. So watch for those upper level cirrus and contrails, and the lower level pop-up cumulus underneath. So I thought this really showed how prevalent multi-layer clouds are, especially with cirrus above and more cumulus beneath. So these types of scenes, both the single layer and multi-layer clouds, occur in very sparse gold. I have a global cloud climatology here, derived from the IPCC. We focus on high clouds specifically. We see that high clouds are most frequent in the tropics and in the mid-latitude storm tracks. But let me go back to this. One of the problems with these global climatology is classifying by high, mid, and low is that you can't really discern cloud types from these types of maps, and you can't really figure out if these are single layer scenes or multi-layer scenes. So going on to this next slide, we can partition the clouds that we see into different cloud types as well as into single layer and multi-layer cases. So we're focusing first on single layer cirrus. So this is our global cloud climatology of those. We see those light blue areas are where those are most frequent. And again, it's kind of, if you squint you can see, but you can see for sure in the tropics those are more frequent as well as in some of the mid-latitude storm tracks.
Ashton, how can you determine different types of clouds by the satellite?
So using this data set uses a combination of CloudSat and Calypso. So Calypso specifically is very sensitive to the high layer clouds, whereas the CloudSat profile can get more information about the location of these types of clouds
in the vertical. So that's
yes.
So if it's at a certain height, you call it cirrus clouds.
Yes, exactly.
You may But you may not know everything about the composition of that cloud.
Right,
Okay,
exactly,
okay.
yeah.
Do you have the slice? Do you have a slice of clouds that clips of it in?
I do not.
Okay.
I think it might actually at the end of my extra slides, so I can bring that up later. So we went over our cirrus, multi-layer clouds are very prevalent as well. We can see that 30 or 29.9 is that annual mean cloud fraction. We can see that these multi-layer clouds are also very prevalent in the tropics as well as in the mid-latitudes. If we partition that further, those multi-layers, we can see that the most frequent top layer in those type multi-layer scenes is cirrus, pretty much globally, except for some altostratus in the polar regions. And underneath those clouds, most frequently we see stratocumulus over the ocean and then altocumulus over land. So some key takeaways. We see that upper level ice clouds exist across the globe, are primarily concentrated in the tropics and the latitude storm tracks. And while single-layer ice clouds are common, multi-layer clouds with cirrus capping lower level liquid clouds are even more common. So why do we care about ice clouds? We've been talking about them for a lot recently. So we care about them because single-layer ice clouds tend to have a warming effect on the atmosphere just due to the fact that they're poor reflectors of solar radiation and good absorbers of outgoing long-wave radiation. However, in multi-layer scenes, that net effect of the high clouds over low is a cooling effect. And that's primarily because the shortwave effect dominates. And so depending on where these high clouds are, they could have either a warming effect on the atmosphere or a cooling effect. So their effects are varying but important for our climate system. However, these type of ice clouds are poorly resolved in climate models. Partially, that's a result of uncertainty in observations. So they're subgrid scale in nature, as we saw from images, and their ice and mixed phase microphysics are not very well understood. So this is an example from a paper. It shows zonal mean ice water path, and it has the zonal mean ice water path from various climate models used in the IPCC AR4 simulations. And then the black lines, those are CloudSat measurements. So we can see that just from looking at this, that obviously models do not do a great job of capturing the ice water path observed. Yeah.
Can I ask an ignorant question? What is ice water path? Is that the integrated water
Yes,
content?
yeah, that's a really
no matter
good-
what phase?
Yeah, that is a great thing to bring up. Yeah, ice water path is just the integrated amount of ice in a column, essentially.
Well, water too, right? What is ice?
Just ice.
Just ice, okay.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, 'cause, you can change between ice and liquid water paths, so those can be separated.
oh, okay.
So that's a good question.
Why do they put the word water in there? It's the only chemical that does this in our atmosphere. Why make that more complicated? Anyway, thank you.
But yeah, so we can see from just from the study that models do not do a good job of capturing the ice microphysics observed across the globe. Specifically in the mid-latitudes, that spread is pretty large. And part of that is because our observations don't do a great job of capturing all the variability of our ice microphysics. So again, we have CloudSat mapped in black, and then various cloud data sets in the colors. We can see that even these global cloud data sets don't do a great job of capturing the zonal mean of these ice microphysics. So as we saw in the previous slide, observations of ice clouds aren't great, and they can be easily influenced by lower level clouds depending on the instrument that we're using to measure these properties. So an example like this, where we have our ice clouds at the top and then liquid clouds closer to the surface. Depending on the instrument you use, you'll be sensitive to different parts of that column. So LiDAR and parts of the IR spectrum are really good for capturing the cirrus clouds, whereas using a solar spectrum is good for the lower clouds, and but it can become this signal can get complicated with the presence of lower clouds. So improving observations of ice clouds in single-layer and multi-layer cases is essential to reducing our uncertainty associated with clouds in climate models. And so that's kind of what we're hoping to do in this research. So there are a lot of great observations of clouds already, or great instruments that can be used to observe clouds. Today we're focusing on the AOS instrument on the Aqua satellite. So AOS stands for Atmospheric Infrared Sounder. It's a high spectral resolution spectrometer. It's a passive instrument, has 2,378 channels in the infrared, and it has a 13.5 kilometer resolution and 1,650 kilometer swath. So it gets a global coverage every 1 to 2 days. So it's instruments like this that are really important for improving our understanding of cloud observations, just because they have they cover such a large area, so we can get good information about our clouds through these passive instruments. Other studies have also combined those instruments those infrared measurements with clouds in Calypso. We didn't focus on those today because there's such a narrow swath that their global coverage it takes a while to get global coverage, whereas the AOS instrument has such a larger swath, it's more easy to get global cloud information. So, on to our research questions. So, my research questions today are: what combinations of AOS channels yield the most information about high altitude ice cloud properties in the mid-latitudes? And then, do channels with the most information change in multi-layer cloud environments, or lower liquid clouds are also present? So how do we tackle that question? First thing we want to do is find the most common ice clouds observed in the mid-latitudes. If we did this analysis on all the ice clouds we see in the mid-latitudes, that would be a lot, and I would never graduate. So we want to find the most common ice clouds observed in the mid-latitudes. We want to simulate what our AOS instrument would measure if these types of clouds are present. And then we want to find which AOS channels are generally most sensitive to the varying cloud properties, so cloud optical depth, particle size, and cloud temperature. So we use the data from the atmospheric radiation measurement Southern Great Plains site. It's located in Oklahoma, and the data that we analyzed from this site was from 2003 to 2009. So this site has a variety of surface-based instruments that measure various atmospheric properties. The ones we were most concerned with were the cloud profiling radar, which is able to give us profiles of the particle size of the clouds over this site and the ice water content. It has a 5-minute temporal resolution and 90-meter vertical grid size, so it has really high resolution measurements of the clouds that pass over. And then they also are able to develop a merge sounding product using various sources of thermodynamic profiles, and so we can get profiles of cloud temperature and cloud pressure from instruments at this site.
Ashtin, how good are the radar-derived ice water contents now? Is it an empirical algorithm?
So the algorithm they use a hierarchy of algorithms at this site that combine the radar measurements as well as the thermodynamic measurements. So the way that they have maybe 5 or 6, depending on the confidence of their measurements and what they are actually able to measure at certain times. So I saw that we definitely did have to do some quality control, but overall we thought that their measurements matched cirrus cloud properties at other sites. So now that we have gone over the instruments at this site, what we're able to do is find the clouds that are observed at this site. So we decided to look at all the profiles from 2003 to 2009, find the highest layer ice clouds, with cloud top temperatures below -20 Celsius. And so this schematic is just sort of that process of finding those higher layer ice clouds, and then the circled ones would be like ones we would include in our analysis. So after we filtered out some of the lower level clouds, we were left with 1.4 times 10 to the 5th upper level ice cloud profiles, which is, again, way too many to analyze. So we reduced that down further using a clustering algorithm. So the example I kind of want to show how this works is going back to this first picture of cirrus clouds. So if you could, from just like a visual inspection, you can see that a lot of these cirrus clouds look pretty similar. So I would make an educated guess that they probably have similar microphysical properties and are likely at similar layers in the atmosphere. And so analyzing each profile, like if we took a bunch of vertical profiles of this scene in particular, it would probably be a little redundant. So what we do is we cluster them together. This is just a bunch of random points just to kind of describe how the clustering algorithm works, but you can imagine that maybe we have cloud top height on the y-axis and the radius on the x-axis. So what we do to cluster them together is we create these centroids. We take all of our cloud points and assign them to these, those closest centroids. We then update their position and continue to repeat until we have a centroid that is more representative of a wide variety of cloud profiles. So you could think of like each of these dots as kind of like each of the cloud profiles in that previous picture, but analyzing all of them would be redundant, so we kind of summarize that into one cluster center. So rather than analyzing here a bunch of clouds that have various cloud top heights and effective radius, we instead analyze one cloud for this purple that has a cloud top height of 4 kilometers and a radius of 6 microns.
How do you know how many initial random points to?
So that is pretty subjective. We chose 500 cluster centers in this case, just because we wanted to make sure that we had detail in our clusters but weren't being too redundant, or that it was a manageable load. So I can show some of those properties in the next slide. So we picked 500 of those clusters. We filtered them down more based on restrictions with the cloud diameter and our ice scattering property data set. And we wanted to make sure that our cluster centers were representative of the points that were associated with them. So we started with 500. We were left with 156 to analyze further. These are all of our cluster centers mapped out. Notice that the y-axis is a log scale. We have in the green and yellow stars, those are those cluster center optical depths. And as we have those cluster center optical depths mapped out, we see that most of the cluster centers have optical depths between 0.1 and 1, or maybe half or 2/3, and then the rest are between that optical depth of 1 and 10. So most of the clouds that we analyzed are thin ice clouds. We do have some thicker ice clouds in there as well. And those yellow stars are ones we ended up relaxing some of our optical depth restrictions so that we could include those thicker ice clouds. So the centers aren't necessarily the best representation of the cloud points that are associated with them, but we wanted to make sure that we had some thicker ice clouds. So what we have plotted here is of all the points that we measured before we clustered, these are some of their properties. On the left, we have the cloud thickness on the y-axis and particle size on the x-axis. And so we see that most of our clouds on the left plot are below 3 kilometers, have 3 kilometers or less in thickness, and have an average particle size of around 50 microns. And then on the right plot, we have cloud top temperature and ice water content. And so we see that most of these clouds have very low amount of ice water, so they're thin, which we would expect. And they're pretty cold as well.
So 250 seems pretty warm for the top of
Yeah.
the ice cloud.
So those were all of our clouds before we ended up clustering and narrowing them down. So yeah, that could have been an error with the measurements or something like that. But once we filtered that down, we got rid of some of those warmer clouds as well. So the gray stars are we took the upper level plots and clustered them into 500 points, and that's what's in the gray. And then the ones that are shaded are the ones that we used, and those are shaded by optical depth. So the clusters tend to represent the main type of the most common ice clouds that we see at the site. So after we found our most common ice clouds, we simulate what errors would measure if these types of clouds are present. So we used our radiative transfer model for that. That calculated line-by-line gradients and Jacobians. I don't want to get into all the specifics of this, but what is important is that we used a 500-meter vertical resolution from the surface up to 20 kilometers, and then extended our profile up to 10 hectopascals. And then we created sort of like an average mid-latitude thermodynamic profile to input into this radiative transfer model. We then integrated those ice cloud clusters into the profile, and since we were concerned about multi-layer clouds as well, we also inserted lower level clouds beneath them to see what our instrument would see in multi-layer cases. Those lower level clouds weren't based on observations. We kind of just wanted to see sort of like a general case of what would happen. So we just assigned one particle size and then just varied the optical depth for those. So this is an example of one of the output from our radiative transfer model. We can see in the lighter color is just the single layer ice cloud brightness temperature. We have brightness temperature on the Y and then wavelength or wave number on the X. So you can see the lightest color is just our ice cloud brightness temperature. And then as that as we go down or get darker in color for those, the lower clouds optical depth is increasing. So that lightest color is just the single layer case, and then the rest are for multi-layer cases. You can already see that the brightness temperature spectrum differ depending on if it's a single layer or multi-layer case.
Why does the increasing optical depth increase the brightness temperature for the short wavelengths?
So I'm assuming that that is just because as the low cloud increases in optical depth, there's more reflection from those lower clouds up towards our sensor. So that would be why I would assume that we would get those higher brightness temperatures at those short wavelengths. So if we can partition that. This is our brightness temperature spectrum just for single layer clouds, and this is where our ice cloud in this single layer case is increasing in optical depth. What we notice right away is that as we increase our optical depth of our ice cloud, we can see that the largest differences in brightness temperature occur in that shorter part of the spectrum, as well as in the IR window region. And so we might think that those channels might have the most, or have high information about the ice clouds we are observing. In our multi-layer case, we can see that that is a similar conclusion. However, that separation in brightness temperature in the shortwave region is even more obvious, and so that might be an important range for analysis data. And then I have a GIF as well, should be loading. That's cycling through the what happens to our brightness temperatures as we increase that optical depth of our low cloud. So we start with this single layer, and then our low cloud's optical depth is increasing. And you can really see that the shortwave spectrum becomes more important in low clouds compared to that IR spectrum.
What is the lower surface of the simulation?
So right now it's we used grass for this situation. We are currently running ocean surface as well, but I didn't have the results done in time. But when Kaiway did this analysis in the tropics, I found that surface wasn't as important for the channel selections that we're using. So
But that was only for ice clouds, not,
that's true.
this low cloud
Yeah.
signal might change when you.
Yeah, I was able to look at the low clouds for the ocean, and it didn't seem like there were very significant differences. So I just wasn't able to include all those in this presentation.
So are you using the same temperature profile and moisture profile for simulation, or yours different?
Yeah. So I was using the same, just a standard temperature and moisture profile, but then integrating the clouds based on where they would fall in that spectrum. So to determine which AIRS channels are most sensitive to those various cloud properties, we kind of had a qualitative look at it now, but we're using this metric called information content, which is super boring, and I'm not going to explain all the details of it here. So if you're really interested in it, I'd look at the Rogers textbook. But qualitatively, it can be described as the factor by which knowledge of a quantity is improved by making measurement. Another way to say it is it describes a decrease in uncertainty of a system state following measurement. So we have a qualitative graph of that. So if we start in that upper left quadrant, we have liquid water path and effective radius on the y and x axis. So let's say we have some general idea of what we're looking at, but when we add a measurement from one channel, which is in this upper right quadrant, we can see that our knowledge about the system, about what we're seeing, is improving. And that decrease in uncertainty between not having a measurement and adding a measurement is the information content. As we go down to that lower left quadrant, we can see that if we add another channel, we can further decrease that uncertainty associated with what we're looking at. And that decrease, the amount of decrease in that uncertainty is also information content. What's nice about this calculation is that it includes an error estimate, so we don't necessarily have to do error analyses afterwards. So these are various error estimates associated with our temperature profiles, humidity, the particle size distribution, and our aerosols. And so these errors associated with these values are incorporated into that information content analysis, and so the channels that we select have these values taken into account, which is really nice. So let's go through an example of that. What we do is we have our radiances that we simulated from our radiative transfer model. We're able to calculate the information content of each channel. What we want to do is find the channel with the most information, which in this case was near around 9 microns, or maybe 9.5 microns. Since we have so many channels, choosing just one is kind of pointless. We have a lot to choose from. So what we can do is pick one channel and sort of recalculate and see if there are other channels that also will reduce our uncertainty. And then we can continue to do that until eventually adding more measurements doesn't add very much information. So that was a lot. Let's look at some results. So we're going to focus first on single air ice clouds. So you looked at the spectrum already. We saw that for brightness temperatures were very different in these two regions based on the optical depth of our ice clouds. And that is kind of reflected into our information content calculations. So just to get everyone oriented, we have wavelength and wave number on the x-axis, and then our total number of selections on the y-axis. And that first, second, and third goes back to the graph that I just showed of the first being the channels with the most information content, the second is the second most, and then third is the third most.
So implicit in the determination of information content is that you're doing basically retrieval, starting with one channel
Yeah.
and then adding channel and seeing how the retrieval improves. So what's the retrieval method? Is it a Bayesian retrieval method, or what's going on there?
We have not gotten that far yet. But we were thinking of using optimal estimation to get to the retrieval method.
But aren't you already having to do a retrieval to determine information content? Don't you need to have a retrieval to compare, for one channel, to compare with the retrieval from two channels to see how much improvement you get? Or how is information content being determined?
So the answer is not really, because in optimal estimation, you have an analytical expression for the error.
Okay,
So
so
you don't
you're
actually
using-
have to do the retrieval. If you assume Gaussian
Okay.
statistics, you don't actually have to do a retrieval to get the posterior PDF.
Okay, so you're basically using expression for the variance from the linear optimal estimation problem.
That's correct.
Got it, thank you.
Yeah, so it's the ratio of that relative to the a priori and then relative to the individual channels. So, yeah, Ashtin, in the process of, once she basically gives you a copy of this to read, you're on her committee, right? Yeah, we're gonna actually try to implement the optimal estimation retrieval, since it's a couple of additional lines of code, and, you know, we'll actually go that extra step, but, yeah.
So what we notice right away for just these single layer ice clouds is that have channels, these are ordered based on their frequency of selection. So channels near 9.5 microns, 10, and 8 microns were often selected first as being having the most information. We also had channels selected near 11 microns very frequently, and then between 13 and 14 microns and around 4.6 microns as well. So those channels seem to have the most information about our single layer ice clouds. One thing to point out is that those shorter wavelengths in our spectrum were not selected very frequently. They were selected at in some cases, but not nearly as much as these channels listed here. Multi-layer clouds. This is our ice cloud scenario, or single layer ice cloud scenario, and then going back and forth is that multi-layer scenario. We notice that those same regions are important and will likely have a lot of information with them. However, in the multi-layer clouds, it's these shortwave channels that are really standing out as having information about our cloud seeds. So the 3.8 to 4.2 micron range is very important in these multi-layer scenarios. But there's some overlap, right? 11 micron channels are selected pretty frequently, as well as that 13 to 14 micron range and our 4.6 micron range. And so this is our first selection, our ice cloud with a low cloud that has an optical depth of 1. When we go to the other end of that spectrum, our multi-layer scenario with a low cloud's optical depth of 20, which was the highest we saw that the channels didn't really change between these different multi-layer scenes, just the frequency of selection changed. So more, as that low cloud increased in optical depth, more of those shorter wavelength channels were selected. So let's go through our conclusions. So back to our research questions. What combination of AIRS channels yields the most information about high altitude ice cloud properties in mid-latitudes? We have, this is kind of a summary figure that I made. This top panel is just our single layer ice clouds, and then these lower ones are multi-layer clouds, where the low cloud is increasing in optical depth as you go down the figure. And so what we see for our single layer case is that the channels in the longer part of our spectrum have the most information about our ice clouds, specifically between 8 and 11 in that higher window region. But there are some selections in the shortwave region as well. And then in multi-layer environments, do these channels with the most information change? Yes and no. There is some overlap, right? So those boxed areas and the underlines on both sides indicate the regions where those channel selections overlapped. But they did differ. For instance, in the single layer case, that 8 micron range and then the 9.5 to 10 micron range was selected, whereas that wasn't selected at all in the multi-layer case. And in multi-layer case specifically, those shorter wavelengths were selected much more frequently than in the single layer case. So how do these results compare to other information content analyses and retrieval methods? So the one study we're going to focus on is Kaiwei's study. He did used the same methods, looked at single layer ice clouds, but looked at them in the tropics instead. And so these circled regions are regions where we found that our single layer channel selections overlapped with Kaiwei's study of tropical ice clouds. However, it was these three regions that were a little bit different, mainly being that we, in our single layer cases, did not have the shorter wavelength channels selected as frequently as they were in the tropical regions. So I have that boxed over here. Let me go back. In that, the IR window region on the left, that those channel selections were just a little shifted from the peak that we found in our study here. So those regions are both boxed. So those shortwave selections that Kaiwei found for the tropical single layer ice clouds were not nearly as frequent as the ones that we found in our single layer case. We think that that's primarily because most of our clouds had were very thin, not very reflective, whereas the ice clouds in the tropics have a higher optical depth. So future work. The main thing is we want to use optimal estimation to attempt a retrieval of our ice cloud properties. We want to expand our cloud selection to include more cluster centers, specifically with higher optical depths. We want to look into expanding this analysis to the MODIS spectrum because MODIS has more channels in the shorter wavelengths, and so we think that might be helpful for retrieving the properties of multi-layer clouds. And then we want to compare this to real measurements from AIRS to make sure that what we're doing is physical and not just a theoretical analysis. So thanks everybody for coming. Thanks to everyone on my committee, Tristan, Elizabeth, and Grant. Thanks for the Aqua group for putting up with all my questions and sitting through my train wreck of a practice talk on Monday. Thanks to Pete, Dee, Sue, Chelsea, Sonia, Maria, and all my family and friends. And thanks to all you guys for coming.
So are there other questions?
I'll ask a simple one. So 9.5 falls in the ozone band. Did ozone variability, is that part of your?
I did not look into ozone variability, but I'd be interested to.
That would affect the range of change.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to look into, but I did not do.
You know, when you showed the maybe you could bring the spectrum up again. I was trying to see if that was on the wings of the. It seemed like it wasn't right in the middle of the ozone band. It was kind of on the edge of it.
This one?
Yes. I wonder if it was a cloud top height. Like I'm kind of wondering if it was almost like an ozone slicing type of thing. But no, the spectrum way back at the beginning actually.
Gotcha.
When you first show the selection, your very first example.
I think this would be the IFIs.
No, this is the summer. So like you have the one with just the stars on it.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah.
So where is that? Actually, maybe it is right in the middle. Yeah.
This is for a single
It's an interesting question. Yeah, it's that first channel is like it's in the ozone.
So what does the question mean for somebody who doesn't know about this stuff?
Well, I was asking because ozone, the amount of ozone varies a lot, so it might be highly uncertain, and I just wondered if that fed into the ranking of that channel.
Oh, I see, okay.
That is a good question.
Yeah, worthy of further investigation, I think.
And is there a way to tell by this whether it's lower stratospheric ozone or boundary layer ozone?
Yeah, I think the boundary layer probably wouldn't be very sensitive, wouldn't have any impact.
Okay.
So probably no stress.
Did you separate day from night?
I did not, and Grant actually brought that up earlier about how these shorter wavelength channels might not be as useful in the night because there's not as much radiation that's much.
So were these simulations for day or for night? Because that would help answer my question about why the brightness temperature went up.
So, I
For
mean,
some
I would
cases.
assume they were for day. I don't think I actually like prescribed. I didn't alternate between day and night, so I'm assuming it was for day.
It's for day, is it
Yeah.
noon? Do you know what time of day? Airs overpass, 1:30 AM, that must be 1:30 PM.
Yeah.
Solar's the other thing of 20 degrees.
But since we were simulating airs, it's about 3 or 4 years ago that we actually set that part of the code up. I'm assuming we did airs at 1:30. No, that's a very good point. So, if you go back one step further, I think what the really interesting part of this is, and maybe since we have so many IR people in the room, you can go back to your spectra, probably the first one, where you show the effect of putting a low cloud. No, one further. Go back. Keep going back.
Oh, this one. This is the same ice cluster, which is very small clouds.
Yeah, so you actually no, I guess you're right. Go forward one. So you see this really different effects going on in the window region versus in the shortwave IR region when you add low clouds. With no low clouds, you have kind of a compressed spread here, so the information content is lower, and you have a kind of more of a spread over here. And then as you add low clouds, you see this gets compressed and that gets spread out. So you have more information about the high cloud because you have a low cloud below it. And that's not something that I would have guessed. I don't know, Andy. Maybe that makes sense, but
No.
the low cloud is pushing the information content over to the shorter wavelengths. But this is information content about the high cloud. It's not,
Right.
So it's an interesting.
So can I ask another question?
Yeah.
So is part of this retrieval, determining a multi-layer situation? Is that part of your?
So we really focus on just retrieving the high cloud properties, not necessarily looking into if we could also retrieve the low cloud properties. But I would assume that could be something that could easily be added in as to figuring out if there are indeed multi-layer clouds there. Yeah.
What are the properties that make up the information content that we're
So-
using to judge this?
Yeah, so it, that calculation is based on, our, the knowledge that we have about our clouds and then, the sensitivity to changes in actual depth, particle size, and cloud depth temperature. So it's that, sensitivity that, really drives our information content calculations.
So I guess you estimated the measurement error covariance matrix for the information content.
Wait,
in
say
the
it again,
background.
sorry.
Usually the information content is calculated from an estimate of the measurement error and an
Yes,
estimate of the backup error, right?
yes, yeah.
And what kind of errors did you use? What did you assume?
For the,
I think optical thickness and,
so these were, we had estimated errors of our profile, as well as errors with the size or the size and shape of our ice particles, the aerosols that we
Okay.
influenced, and then that were there, as well as errors with the instrument, and I feel like there was one more. But so we incorporated these errors with the measurement and the profile
and I assume they were diagonal.
yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that right? Are they diagonal? Trying to think of how. Kind of forgot. Thought we included off diagonal correlations between
You did.
channels. I really think we
Then
did.
probably,
Yeah.
okay.
Sorry, these are the details that I've. they're quite far back in time
I'm
now.
pretty sure that's in her thesis, so
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering the main purpose of your work, is for the improvement in the ice cloud properties or both ice cloud and these liquid cloud?
Yeah, so we're mainly interested in improving the ice cloud retrievals. So not as much the low clouds, but just because ice clouds are inherently thin and difficult to measure, we really just wanted to focus on the ice clouds.
So for that, just wondering maybe the information content you got in the shortwave maybe not from the ice cloud, maybe it's from the underneath liquid cloud.
Yeah,
That information.
that is something I have considered and definitely need to think about a little more.
Yeah, but that was part of the discussion, so the only thing we're retrieving here is ice cloud properties.
Right.
So the information content is about ice cloud properties, just in the presence of a low cloud or with no low cloud below it. So we're just we're basically changing the background
Right.
above which the ice cloud sits, but the information content is always still relative to just ice cloud properties. So there's no information about the low cloud in the retrieval, like it's not even, we're not retrieving anything about the low cloud.
The low cloud is just part of the geophysical noise.
That's right,
basically, yeah.
that's right. So there's no, so it is ice cloud information content. That's why I said I think it's interesting that it shifts. Where you get your information about the ice cloud shifts to the shorter wavelengths when you put a brighter background underneath it, basically.
Well, I think it's an interesting question then. How does the problem of having low water clouds, introducing those as a possible background, differ from the problem of introducing all kinds of other backgrounds, whether it's ice, whether it's water, whether it's vegetation,
Right.
sand, whatever, they're all basically a background problem. And so this is just one example or one specific subset of those
It is.
background.
Or, yeah, well,
Variability
this may
problems.
even be it's almost like a superset, because the lower cloud can actually have almost a full spectrum of brightnesses, because you can go
Right.
from a very low optical depth to a very thick optical depth, so it spans every brightness, whereas the discrete surface types you're talking
Well,
about
the
are
street, yeah,
more
right,
individual.
you get a
but-
variable vegetation coverage too and things, but
Yeah,
yeah.
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 But no, you're right, I think that's what this is sort of boiling down to in some ways. So maybe some experiments of switching to ocean surface might give us a little bit of an idea there. Like just looking at ice clouds in ocean versus land without any low cloud might help us.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Cloud is complicated. So for the particle size, there is very good signal in the 11, 12 micron, especially if you give different particle size, give it a different shape. So how does the particle size influence your channel selection result?
Yeah, so I found that was really hard to measure just because we were looking at retrieving, or like the information content of like the three variables together, specifically cloud top temperature, optical depth, and particle size. So I found it like kind of difficult to separate out each individual property. But you can think of that, or like the particle size is incorporated into that ice cloud optical depth, and we saw that when those optical depths are changing, that especially those infrared channels were. So I think it'd be a good analysis to try and look at just specific changes in particle size. That's not something.
So you could maybe hold the optical depth fixed and
Yes.
just retrieve like
Right.
vector radius. It's an interesting idea.
So it's probably beyond the scope of your thesis, but it would be an interesting question to look at the question of why the certain channels that got selected were selected. Why were they better providing this information than other channels? There's always the question of the ozone. I think that the picture might change if ozone variability is included because of that first channel being in that band. But to take the 13 and 14 micron channel that shows up a little later, it seems like that's right on the edge of the CO2 band, and so there might be some implicit CO2 slicing going on.
Yeah.
But just kind of trying to figure out what the actual source of the information content would be.
Right.
That's probably a thesis project in its own right,
Okay.
once the channel is selected, but it'd be an interesting question.
Yeah, I think that'd be good to look into, and just comparing these selections to like current retrieval methods, I think would be helpful.
Yeah, some of our previous work has also shown that, in these old 2006 papers, that CO2 slicing channel does pop out for certain types of clouds. I'm thinking it's the optically thin clouds because it gives you more better sensitivity to cloud top temperature for the optically thin clouds. But the ozone question is very interesting. I haven't thought much about that.